Good afternoon. Welcome to All Saints. It's great to have you here on this occasion. I want to begin by acknowledging the Wallamata people as traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we gather, honouring elders past, present and those who are emerging. Welcome to All Saints. My name is Reverend Michael, for those who don't know me, and I do welcome you to Soundings. Soundings is a series of seminars which began in this parish, I think 30 plus years ago, under Clive Harcourt Norton, with many others, and it looks at the intersection of faith with issues of our wider society. It is offered as a gift to our community, and so we pray that it might be a benefit to you this day. It has been several years since it actually happened in this place, or in terms of Soundings taking place thanks to COVID. And so this seminar marks a new beginning, and with that a variation in the format. We'll firstly hear from our speaker today, then there'll be a short time of Q&A, and I will have a little microphone to bring to those who are doing that so that we can all hear, including those who are watching on our live stream. So just to make you aware, you are being recorded. So without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Leisa Aitken, our presenter today. Leisa is a clinical psychologist who has been counselling and teaching for more than 25 years in workplaces, hospitals, churches and private practice. Her PhD was on the psychology of hope, inspired by the desire to help her patients be more hopeful. Her thesis observed the foundational reflections on hope through Western history in philosophy, theology, and more recently in psychology, as well as research on the experience of hoping for Australians in the last 5 years. Leisa is married to Michael, and they have 2 adult daughters and a 60-kilogram Rhodesian Ridgeback. To manage her own mental health, she paddles on an ocean ski, surf ski, designed for the ocean swell around the beautiful northern beaches of Sydney. Her topic today is hope, which is her PhD thesis, and has been part of her experience for at least the last 10 years as she's been focusing on that. I think we can all agree that conversations about hope are indeed timely. There is so much need for such a conversation at this time. And this seminar will therefore explore the question, what is hope? We'll analyse some of the reasons that many of our society, and especially our young people, are struggling to have hope, as well as the relationship between hope in Christian theology and our psychological experience of being hopeful. So please welcome Dr. Leisa Aitken.
Good afternoon, everyone. So lovely to be here. And the first soundings for a while from the sound of it. So let's start a deep dive into hope. Why we've lost it, what it is, and how we can have more of it. As Michael said, hope is a timely topic. When I tell people that that was the topic of my PhD, the most common response is, oh my goodness, we really need to think about hope. Some people say that we're in a hope crisis, others a meaning crisis, and certainly a mental health crisis, especially for young people. Now, here goes the technology. Woohoo, it worked. So you can see, hopefully, the screen. These are the US statistics since 2010, but the Australian statistics are really similar. If you can see, the 18 to 25-year-olds have nearly 140% increase in anxiety in the last 14 years. A little bit less, sort of around 100% for the 26 to 34, 50% 35 to 49, and 10%-ish in the over 50. So you can see it's quite weighted, isn't it, for young people really struggling. But it's all heading in the wrong direction. For young people, for that youngest age, 18 to 25, there's been about 106% increase in depression and a 60% increase in suicide. There was a UK study on young people aged 16 to 29, and 90% of them said their life lacks purpose or meaning. It's pretty sobering, isn't it? Evidence for this also came from my own research in 2020, and I asked young people, I asked a whole group of many hundreds of Australians, not just young people, young and old, what is your best realistic hope for humanity? It's a big question. And they had 4 options. They could say no hope. They could say my best hope is that things don't get worse. Or I have hope for the next few generations, but then I'm not sure. Or no, humanity will flourish indefinitely. And the under 25s were significantly more likely than, say, the over 45s to say, my best hope is that things don't get worse. Now, is that hope? What it tells you is that they're assuming things are going to get worse. There's a narrative of decline, and they just want to stop it. But there's no big vision for what you're hoping for that you can, move towards or act towards. I think it's really worrying. So the question I ask is, how do we give Australians, but especially young Australians, hope for the future? And we do need to understand what's going on, like why is this mental health crisis happening? Because this definitely corresponds with a hope crisis as well. Another thing people often say to me when I say I've been doing this PhD on hope is, it's not surprising we're all losing hope, because look at the world around us. Look at the, Ukraine, Gaza, we've just had a pandemic, it's terrible. But in one sense, these things have always been with us, haven't they, as humans for millennia? One of the really interesting things doing my PhD research was I didn't just look at contemporary psychology and neuroscience and what it has to say about hope. I also went back to look at sort of the origin story of our Western understanding of the concept. So I started with Plato and Aristotle, looked at what the Bible had to say, then scholars of the Middle Ages, Aquinas or Julian of Norwich, into the Enlightenment, Descartes and Hume and Hobbes, and then Kant and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and a whole lot of more modern philosophers, Marxist, existential, analytic, deconstructionist, and theologians. And it took me 2 years, I read their original writings just on hope from this huge span of history. And one of the fascinating things was you get to know what's going on in the world when they're writing, when you do that. And these issues that people say, the world today, they've actually always been around, haven't they? You could think of Augustine. So he's writing in the 4th century. It's the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. It's chaos. The world is volatile politically. There's war, there's carnage, there's devastating plagues, what we would now call pandemics. And he is writing about hope, unsurprisingly. Julian of Norwich is writing in the 1400s. She wrote the earliest surviving work in English by a woman. And she's an anchoress living in the church in Norwich. She's famous for the line, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." But what's going on around her is the bubonic plague. She nearly died from the bubonic plague. She was given the last rites, but 40% of Norwich died from the plague. There's peasant uprisings, there's the 100 Years' War going on, and Norwich, because it's near the North Sea, there was a 4 to 6 metre storm swell that flooded Norwich, and in her writings she talks about just the tops of houses peeping over. So all of these things, natural disasters, wars, they've been around for a long time. I don't think that's the cause for this dramatic increase in mental distress and lack of hope. When I'm speaking in, whether it's a church or a school or a workplace, the most common word I hear is we're feeling overwhelmed. This is something a little bit perhaps unique that's happening for this generation and especially young people. And I think this has got 2 origins. It's not just my thoughts, it's reading a lot of sociologists and social commentators. The first one is this. When Julian of Norwich had all those things going on around her, she wasn't sitting in her church room looking on her phone at images of all of the wars, or on social media with people who were in the middle of the floods talking about how distressing it was, or on her laptop looking at the protests and the uprisings. But in our world, and for younger people, they have grown up with this 24/7 exposure to every negative event that's happening and the negative commentary. It's how the news cycle works, isn't it? Let's keep it negative, it hooks people in. And as well as exposure to concerns about the environment and climate change, which for young people are really distressing, that exposure has not happened before. Augustine and Julian of Norwich just didn't have it. The second thing is the overload of information. Every choice, there's so much data out there to make these decisions. I work with a lot of parents who have children where the children have multiple diagnoses. Many are neurodiverse, they have autism or ADHD, as well as anxiety, depression, or a range of things. And parents wanting to be good parents are Googling and looking up, how do I best parent someone with this or this or this? There is so much information and so many different perspectives, different advice, and they've lost often confidence in their own principles of parenting because there's just too much information out there, and that can be overwhelming, and they sort of feel like giving up, that loss of hope. And lastly, social media with its addictive qualities. These two books, the blue one, Jonathan Haidt's books, just come out in the last month. And Jean Twenge is another. They're both psychologists who've been looking at the impact of this generation growing up with phones sort of attached to themselves, and especially social media. It's designed to be addictive. And of course, when young people when they're in their rooms on screens, they're not out playing, they're not sleeping well, they're not having face-to-face interaction. So it's not just what's on the screen, it's also what's not happening, and we need all those things to cope well and to feel hopeful. So it's obviously not that technology is bad per se, but we really haven't worked out, and especially for this generation growing up with it, how to manage it well. The other thing that's happened is we have lost the grand shared narratives that previous generations had to give our lives meaning and purpose and a vision for the future. As individuals, we are obviously always trying to find our place in ourselves, and all of us when we're young, I'm sure if you recall when you were a teenager, early 20s, we're all trying to find our identity and our place. And I've noticed a shift even in the last 20 years. It used to be if I was working with, say, uni-age patients, that they were looking for their identity outward. They were trying to find their people, which music or sport or passion that they could align with. And they were trying to work out which religious framework or nothing made sense to them. But it was some inward looking, sure, but also a lot of finding their place in the world. The narrative now for the sort of uni-age patients whom I see, they're all about looking inside themselves, creating their own identity and branding it on social media, creating their profile. You do you is a phrase that they use all the time. This relentless self-invention and reinvention, and then algorithms on social media which lock them into an ever-narrowing echo chamber. This looking inside to find yourself rather than outside, I don't think it's been really helpful, because as the stories we live by become smaller, they're sort of buckling under the pressure when things get tough. When faced with our own vulnerability, young people need something bigger than just themselves and their own creation of meaning and identity to hold on to. We've lost the shared narrative. We've lost that sort of Judeo-Christian narrative that we used to connect in with. Whether people were Christians or not, there was a sort of a shared sense of it in society. And it means we've also lost a bit of a shared vision for the future. All right, enough with the depressing stuff, why we've lost hope. Let's pivot. What is hope? How do we develop and how do we nurture it? Now, extraordinarily, as I looked across all those philosophers and theologians whom I just mentioned, and the psychological research, there were 4 common themes which came up again and again. So we're going to go through those 4 today. They each are elements of hope, so you can work on any of those 4 to improve your hope or someone else's hope, but they do build together best, to work on all 4 is best. And to make sure that I was on the right track and I wasn't just in a world of academia, I did ask many hundreds of Australians on 2 occasions, 2018 and 2020, if this applied in the real world, and happily it did. So let's just clarify what hope is not, because we use the word a lot and a lot of people get confused. I could say I hope to be a Jedi warrior. That's not really hope. That is wishful thinking or a fantasy, because hopes must be realistic. I could say I hope for dessert. That is a want or a desire, a common desire on my part, but hopes are bigger than dessert. They must be deeply meaningful and noble. I hope my friend with cancer is healed, that sort of thing. I could say I hope to go to Pilates tomorrow. That's a goal. Hopes are more uncertain, not in my full control usually, and nearly always involve waiting. Or I could say I hope the weather is fine. That is optimism. Optimism is when we look to a good future, but we can't necessarily do anything to bring it about. When you hope for something, you will do what you can to make it happen, or find others to help you, or do it together. You will make it happen. It involves agency, is our jargon. And through history, these scholars had three sort of concentric circles of hope. You hope for yourself, don't you? And for your children, your grandchildren, those you love. But we also hope for humanity. And of course, we are part of humanity, they're not disconnected. And we have transcendent spiritual hopes for what will happen after death. So, let's go through the four common aspects of hope. As I said, you can nurture hope from any of them. The first one is longer, and then there's three much shorter ones, so don't panic if you think this is going to go on for too long. All right. The first one is possibilities. I believe that the future can be meaningful. It makes sense, doesn't it? If you don't have a sense that the future has meaningful possibilities, you can't really hope. And possibility thinking is a skill that people can learn. What it means is that as you think about the future, you don't just think of one option. You embrace many possibilities. So let me give you a worked example. As I shared in the church when I spoke there the other week, I'm hoping to write a book on hope. It's not a goal yet. It's pretty uncertain. I have no time this year to do it, so it's in the future. And it involves quite a few things coming together, me having the time and organising perhaps some funding to have the time to do it. Now, possibility thinking means I do think of the best case scenario. The best case scenario is next year, I get some funding, I set aside time and I have it done in a year. That would be awesome. So I could just say, well, that is my hope. But meaningful, good possibility thinking means I have a range of ideas. So maybe I don't do it in 1 year, maybe I do it in 3 to 5 years, and that is still my hope, and that is still meaningful for me. Maybe I never get to write it as a book, but I write it as a series of essays or blogs on my website, and that builds up, and that would still be a meaningful way to do it. Maybe I never get around to doing it, but I give lots of talks, and that's the way that I share my information. So what I do around that is when I have a journal and I write my hopes, and I write all the different possible meaningful things the ways that it could happen, rather than get stuck on one way, because then you get disappointed if that one way doesn't work out. But there's many meaningful possibilities. Now there's at least two potential roadblocks that we have to this possibility thinking. So we're going to start way back with Plato and Aristotle, which is where I started in my reading. I was really shocked to find that in the classical world, the Greco-Roman world, they thought hope was a waste of time. They didn't want hope. It wasn't a virtue in any of their systems. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that the Greco-Roman world has a cyclical view of time. So you would live your life, a few more generations happen, then the universe gets burned up, and then you will live your life again doing exactly the same thing, as will the following generations. And this is the cycle in the Greco-Roman world. Change is a bad thing. For Plato, if you know anything about Plato, truth is always changeless. It's static. Now, hope requires change, possibilities. And if you've got this very strong sense of fate and determinism, because we just do life over and over, you're not going to privilege hope. As other societies, like, for example, Hinduism doesn't privilege hope because they've got that same cyclical cosmology. But we live in the West with a Judeo-Christian view of time. It's not cyclical, it's linear. So we have a creation at the beginning, we have an end, but in the Christian view, there's a lot of open-ended possibilities for us as humans in the meantime. You know, we're in, Tom Wright is a theologian, talks about it as a play with many acts. And we know the final act, God has revealed that, but we get to ad lib now as we're waiting. We get to create and have possibilities. So a view of time impacts whether we hope, but also the Greco-Roman world, especially the Stoics, you might recall, they really avoided emotion, and especially negative emotions. They thought it should be avoided at all costs. It didn't lead to happiness. And they didn't like hope because, as they pointed out, and it's true, if you hope for something, you could be disappointed. And you might you might be crushed. You might really desperately want something, and it doesn't happen. And wouldn't it have been better not to have hoped? That was their argument. And people do, I see this in my patients all the time. I had a beautiful patient, and his wife was, she was dying of a motor neurone disease. It wasn't exactly that, but similar. And he desperately hoped for a medical cure, for God to intervene, and it didn't happen. She passed away, and he said to me after, it would have been better to not hope. And my response is, could you not hope? Like, is that possible? If it's someone you love, you can't not hope. Of course you hope for the good for them. It's imprinted in our DNA. But it is a risk, isn't it? Every time we hope for something, that we will be disappointed. Let me convince you it's worth taking the risk. For a start, if you assume the worst and you don't hope, that negativity pulls into the present. But high hope, this is from my research as well as others, if you work on hope, you're likely to be more optimistic, you'll have more well-being, you'll have more sense of meaning in life, more positive emotions, more adaptive coping strategies, more beliefs that are protective for trauma, and lower depression, anxiety and stress. Did I sell it? you wanting some hope? I think taking the risk to hope is worth it. The second roadblock is anxiety. And this really impacts possibility thinking because the red bit on the screen there is your prefrontal cortex. That's where possibility thinking lives. When you experience a threat, it could be anything, and your body initiates that anxiety response, the fight-flight response, what goes on in your brain is your prefrontal cortex shuts down. And because you don't want to think of lots of good possibility thoughts if you're being chased down a dark alley, what you want to do is go, oh my gosh, I'm in survival mode. What's the worst case scenario and how can I survive that? So our brain, whether we like it or not, you get too much overwhelm, too much stress, too much anxiety, and you're inclined to do worst case scenario thinking. So I do think of it like the dodgy shopping trolley that keeps going left, and it takes effort to make it go a straight line and not just assume the worst. And certainly, as I've said, for young people, overuse of technology seems to be really contributing to the increase in anxiety, because what we need to do to manage anxiety is sleep well, exercise, have really healthy relationships, and not try to do relationships in the precarious world of online and social media. So anxiety definitely gets in the way of possibility thinking, and every time you work on your own or someone else's stress and anxiety, you're helping yourself to have hope. The other thing about meaningful possibilities is the meaning aspect. Hope is not rose-coloured glasses. Some of you may have read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, that he wrote after the concentration camps of World War II. And he talks a lot about hope in there. Hope has to be able to make sense in a concentration camp. The palliative care literature, people dying, talks a lot about hope, hope for a meaningful death. So how do we experience meaning? Roy Baumeister is one of my favourite psychologists, and he and his team asked people to notice, were they thinking about the present, the past, or the future? So their phones would go off and they had to write, quickly write what they were thinking, what was going on in their thoughts. People who focused on the present a lot, who did lots of mindfulness, were actually the happiest among them. But it came at a cost, because they did not find their lives as meaningful as those who did roughly a third in the past, about a third in the present and a third in the future. Because Baumeister argues that creates a storyline, doesn't it? You think about your past, and now I'm sort of in the middle, in the present, but I'm anticipating a future. That's the story arc, the narrative arc of my life. And we need those stories and those narratives to find life meaningful. Now, of course, how you imagine the end of your story is closely entwined with how you imagine the end of humanity's story. And I asked Australians in 2020, how much do you put your trust in the following for the future of humanity? And you can see on the screen there, they had 12 options. So do you put your trust in government, those with money or power, science, artificial intelligence, God or a higher power, collective action, evolutionary progress, the belief that good will conquer evil, the belief that things happen for a reason, inherited wisdom and traditions, the younger generation or the older generation? So I really wasn't sure what I was going to get with these. So they were just general Australians, and their religious frameworks corresponded with the last census, so it wasn't loaded with Christians or anything like that. It was just typical Australians. Now, the most common answer was science. People put their hope in science for the future of humanity. And this is happening during the pandemic, of course, too, when vaccines are a big thing. But the really interesting thing was that didn't correlate with people feeling hopeful. People said, well, I do put my trust in science, but they weren't particularly hopeful. Nor was trust in AI, artificial intelligence. Now, there's a lot of academics and a lot of philosophers now who say that we're probably going to destroy the planet, so our best hope for humanity is to upload our brains onto a giant AI supercomputer. And they're very serious about this, and who knows, maybe the technology will happen soon. But people who put their trust in AI didn't feel particularly hopeful either. The other interesting one was trust in evolutionary progress alone. Again, that was quite high on the list, but people didn't feel particularly hopeful if that was what they put their trust in. One of the philosophers that I read was a man called Richard Rorty, and he is an atheist, pragmatist philosopher. And so he believed that evolution was the thing he had to put his hope in. He said it's the most logical thing, as someone who had no spiritual belief whatsoever. But he's really honest. He has a very big book called A Social Hope. He's really honest. He says, if it's just evolution, then all we've got to put our hope in as humans, and our track record isn't very good when it comes to wars, when it comes to caring for the earth. And he says, really, there's no driving force in evolution other than survival of genes. Survival of the strongest, sacrifice of the weakest. Doesn't mean we're going to get any better or have a good society. It just means we will survive. So it's really interesting. He was desperate to find hope. He wanted to be hopeful, but he had to be realistic. Evolution if that's all you've got, doesn't necessarily lead to hope if there's no God involved in evolution. But 3 of those did correlate with actually feeling hopeful. And the strongest one was belief in God. People who believed in God or a higher power beyond us as humans were the most hopeful. And the second 2, I hadn't quite expected, so I'm going to unpack them a bit. They were the belief that good will conquer evil, that justice will be done, and the belief that things happen for a reason, that one day it will all make sense. Now, it seems to me that, as Rorty found, if you're going to believe that justice will be done and good will conquer, you can't just trust in humans. And the same with making sense of life. We often have no idea why our lives turn out the way they do. And of course, these 2 beliefs are very similar to the end of the Christian narrative. Justice is done, it all makes sense. And as we've said, the Judeo-Christian heritage runs deep in Western society. The fascinating thing is many people believe these. Like I said, these weren't Christians saying this. But it's the air that we breathe, isn't it? This expectation that somehow in the end justice will be done. Somehow it will make sense. So many people have stopped perhaps identifying as Christians, but they still believe in a sort of aspect of Christian hope. So what is the hoped for future in the Bible, in the Christian narrative? Well, it is that we are born into a story that starts before us and continues on. We don't just sort of invent our own little story. And yes, at the end of the story, good does conquer evil because God steps in to make it right. And he judges all evil, even evil done in secret. And this is really important. I counsel quite a lot of patients who've had horrific abuse happen. Their abusers have died and justice was never done. And for them, it's so important that there is justice one day for even things done in secret. And there will be a time when we will understand the purpose of it all and the reason. And the Christian view is that at this time, God restores this beautiful earth in the new creation, where the Amazons ablaze with life, where the Great Barrier Reef has its colour back. And it's not just the earth that is renewed in the new creation, it's also human culture. If you look at the prophecies from Isaiah of vineyards and music, and it's a beautiful restoration in some version of our life. I didn't grow up in a Christian family, and I always thought when I was young, the Christian view of heaven is these sort of disembodied souls floating off. I guess too many medieval artworks watching this. I didn't realise it was so embodied and restored, and I much prefer this new creation to my brain being uploaded onto a supercomputer and living forever as an algorithm. This sounds wonderful. And the Christian faith looks to a past event, to Jesus, and the historical record about him, Jesus who overcame nature, who participated in our suffering, and ultimately overcame death, and was resurrected into this new body, and we will get, like him, resurrection bodies. I think it's the ultimate sign that we can trust that God is on our side. And I think it's crucial that overcoming death is part of our hope. Well, for me it has been. I shared earlier that my dad died when I was 15, and my mum and I nursed him for 2 years before he died. He had lung cancer. And I remember as a 15-year-old looking at his body on the day he died and thinking, that's going to be me one day. Doesn't that just deplete every hope I have? Doesn't death just make a mockery of it? And as I explored religions in my sort of more uni age, I thought, Jesus overcame death. That is unique among religions. And for me, it was extremely convincing. All right, so that was our first one. I told you that was going to be long. The next three are really short. So the first one was that we need to believe in meaningful possibilities, that possibility thinking, connecting what's meaningful. The second one is waiting well. I can cope and be poised to act. Because like I said, if you hope for something, you will do what you can to make it happen. But it's not a goal that you can do tomorrow. It involves waiting. And this is hard. I don't know how you feel about getting the wheel of death on your computer. I just have no time for patience. It frustrates me so much if I have to wait. And yet when hard times come, our capacity to wait well and to cope and to persevere, as the Bible often calls it, is really crucial. So coping is hoping, and I think fishing is the best analogy. If you've ever I don't mind rod fishing, but I like just a line fishing in a dinghy over the edge of a boat. And you can have to wait a long time sometimes, can't you, for a fish? But you have to be somewhat poised and ready the minute you feel the nibble to pull the line in. So you're waiting and you're coping, but you're poised as well, ready to act. In the 3rd century, Tertullian said, hope is patience, but with the lamp lit, ready to go. Now, in our society, we have so many ways of coping to choose from. As philosopher Charles Taylor has said, freedom of choice, we have so many choices, but freedom of choice is only valuable insofar as we choose well. Or to give the Bible's version of it, everything may be permissible, but not everything is beneficial. So in 2020, I did this research where I asked people, how do you cope when you have to wait for things you hope for? And some coping strategies were not associated with hope and some were. So the ones that were not were basically distraction. Comfort eating, comfort drinking, using drugs, endless hours on screens, phones, gaming, binge watching TV, scrolling YouTube. The thing they all have in common is they're just distraction. Now, of course, we all do a bit of that from time to time, of all of those, but for many young people especially, those are all their main coping strategies, not only young people. But they don't help you stay hopeful. They're just distraction. What does work is approach coping. So these are things like finding a friend, talking to a friend, journaling your feelings, doing a little bit of mindfulness, not too much, but a bit, prayer, exercise, creative hobbies. We already know those things are good for us. They're going to help us manage stress. They're going to help us in relationships. But they all take more effort. Much easier just to watch TV or eat a cake or whatever to make us feel good. But Aquinas in the 13th century, he defined hope as a stretching out to the good. So in these coping strategies while we wait, they also need to be for our good, rather than just distractions. The third aspect is relationships, because sometimes, so it's I have others I trust who can help. Sometimes you can't bring about your hope by yourself. So with my hope book, sure, I have to do the writing, but I'm going to need some support. I'm going to need people to help fund me. I'm going to need a publisher. So I'm always poised and sort of looking out for where are their connections, especially within the publishing world. And we need help from others in other ways, don't we? My husband had a knee replacement last year. Our hope was in his surgeon, of course, and in God to oversee it. But sometimes we have to hope in others. And we have collective hopes. As a family, you might work together for something you're hoping for, as a church, as a school, in your workplace. Kierkegaard says love takes hope upon itself as the work of hoping for others in this collective hope. So there's so much actually evidence that relationships and including others in what you hope for matters. But there's two pieces of research I'll pull out. One was in my own research. I asked people, and I wonder what you'd answer for this. How many relationships do you have in which you feel you belong? None. Some people sadly said none. 1 or 2, sort of 3 to 5, 6 to 10, and it went up. People who had none or just 1 to 2 did not have much hope in life. There was a very poor correlation. But at 3 to 5, it started to make a really big difference, and it sort of went up from there. So you do need a sort of a minimum number of people that you trust who'll come alongside you and help you build up your hopes. The other piece of evidence is this book, The Power of Hope, which records the findings of Carol Graham. She's an American economist. She has been an advisor to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And although she's an economist, she uses hope as a well-being metric in her research. And one of her most interesting pieces that she records in this book was she looked at 18 to 21-year-olds in really poor communities, white communities in America, black communities in America, and a community in Peru, really, really poor in Peru. And what she found was that the white communities, the young people, were the least hopeful out of the three. And she said the significant difference was they had this strong ethos of, I'll make it myself. They didn't know their neighbours, they didn't trust their neighbours, and their parents were not very involved in their lives. It was individualism, and they were not hopeful. The black communities had more hope than the white communities. They had a lot more extended family involvement, church involvement, they trusted their neighbours, they did better. But the most hopeful were the Peruvian young people who were really poor, really, really poor, but rich relationally. Their parents were very involved. Their extended family were really involved. They were involved in church. If people did well in life and they could leave this really impoverished area, they would still come back and coach the soccer team or help out sing in the choir. This rich relationship. And so these young people were the most hopeful. I think it's really encouraging if you want to give hope to your children, to your grandchildren, to the young people, get involved in their lives. Having that richness of resource of relationships really matters. The last thing to say about relationships is to beware over-functioning and under-functioning. So, for example, I have various patients, so for example, one who has postnatal depression. She's really struggling. She's not, she's sleep deprived. She's got a newborn baby. She's depressed. And she needs people around her who can loan her hope, that she can borrow it from them, who can say to her, let me bring you a meal, let me take the baby, it's going to be okay, you'll survive being there, or whatever it takes to loan her some hope. And that's not over-functioning for her, that's what she needs. But as she starts to get better, as she starts to get a bit more sleep and do a bit better, you don't want to still be bringing her meals and constantly there. You need to back off, don't you, so that she starts to feel competent and confident. And so you go from having to do a lot to pulling back. What I notice in a lot of parents when their children are really struggling, their children are anxious, their children are depressed, and parents know these children need hope and they step in and they do a lot for them, which is helpful if they really can't do it themselves. But then a lot of parents stay there in what we then start to call over-functioning, where the child actually has got a capacity to do a little bit more, to do some chores, to get out, to not just be on their screens. And parents need to pull back so that their children can pick up a bit and have that agency, have that sense of autonomy, because they need that to hope. So there's this tricky balance where you don't want to over-function because it keeps people stuck in under-functioning. But you do need to help, and sometimes the over-functioner has to pull back for the under-functioner to pull up. I hope that makes sense, that as we loan hope, we have to have eyes to see this delicate balance that doesn't undermine their agency and their competence and their capacity to do what they hope for. All right, so that was relationships. They're very important for hope, but we need to be careful. And the other relationship that matters is spirituality. Now, in my research, I consistently saw, when I asked people how important is spirituality for you, those who said it was the most important were the most hopeful over and over. When I said to people, what would you do to make yourself feel hopeful? And they could say anything. The people who said, I would pray, were the most hopeful. There's something profound about that trust in God relating to spiritually and hope. It's important to say not every type of spirituality is associated with flourishing. Unfortunately, there's certainly spirituality characterised by abuse, manipulation, coercion, that is damaging and at times tragic. But healthy spirituality, freely chosen, with positive, trusting relationships, including with God, is amazing for a sense of hope. Harvard University recently they have a human flourishing program, and they were looking at the skyrocketing deaths of despair in America. So deaths of despair are deaths by substance abuse or suicide. They're sort of clumped together. They're essentially lack of hope deaths. Those who go to church regularly were 5 times less likely to die from deaths of despair than those who don't. There's something very protective about engaging spiritually for hope. And on this particular little aspect, I'm going to leave you with some words of Jesus, which is from Matthew 11. It's from a version called The Message, so it might sound a bit different to what you're used to. Jesus says, are you tired, worn out, burnt out? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. So there's something about that type of spirituality that really helps with hope. Lastly, glimpses. I have eyes to see glimpses to give me feelings of hope. So we need to imagine at least a glimpse of the future to get the feeling. So the belief in meaningful possibilities is a belief. It's how you think. The action piece of waiting well or involving relationships is behaviour, it's action. But hope is also a feeling. And to get the feeling, you need to use your imagination. You need to get a glimpse. So let's do a little exercise. Here we have a tropical island. What I'd like you to do is just imagine for a minute. You're not in a cold church hall. You're lying on that beach. There's warm sand and a warm breeze. And you have nothing pressing to do that day. You're on holiday. Can you get a little taste of it in your mind's eye? And do you just get a little bit of the feeling of relaxation and calm and warm, maybe? You might have to nudge the person next to you if they've closed their eyes and they've nodded off. It's really powerful, isn't it? Just a little glimpse of what we hope for. And this group of psychologists, headed by Martin Seligman, argue that humans shouldn't be Homo sapiens, wise man. We should be Homo prospectus, future-thinking man. Do you know that we think about the future 2 to 3 times more than we think about the past? And they report in this book a mix of neuroscience and other research. When you imagine the future in your mind's eye, it creates a more intense emotional response in your brain than when you remember the past. God has designed us that this is disproportionately powerful just to get a glimpse of what you're hoping for in the future. And then it sort of pulls backwards into the present so you can feel the little taste of the joy or the relief when you imagine what you hope for. So I'm imagining my book is coming out and I'm at the book signing and I can feel the relief and the joy, and that motivates me, doesn't it, to want to get on and do it. You're probably all going to rush home and book a tropical island holiday now that you've had that little taste. It's how we're designed. And so with my book, I'm going to imagine in my mind's eye the range of possibilities. So what is your hope? I wonder what some of your hopes are in the next 5 years or 10 years. Try to imagine them in your mind's eye. Don't just do the worst case scenario, but the best case scenario and all the other possibilities. So we can imagine our hopes, but the other thing that we can do is have eyes to see the glimpses. This was a cup my daughter gave me just when I was starting my PhD. Where there's tea, there's hope, 2 of my great loves. Having eyes to see tangible glimpses. So for example, I have a patient who has a son with level 3 autism. She is his full-time carer. She needs a well-deserved break. She tries to have them regularly, but there's often a long delay in getting him into some respite so she can have a little break. And so what we talked about was when she goes onto her back deck to have a cup of tea during the day, he's inside, and she has her cup of tea, see this as a glimpse of rest. It's a little taste. You will get your rest, but this is going to keep you going. It's a glimpse of what you hope for. It's not just about being mindfully in the present with the tea on the deck. It is that, but it's more than that. It's seeing it as a taste of you will have rest. Another example is in relationship counselling. I often, when people come, they're on their best behaviour for the first session or 2, and then by the 3rd session they're a bit more relaxed and there can be a bit of argy-bargy in the room and they have arguments in front of me. And it's fascinating to watch how sometimes they're in the middle of an argument and then there's this glimpse of understanding between them. Or someone starts laughing and they recall something funny together. And I say to them, hold that little taste of togetherness. That's a glimpse of where you want to go. It's having eyes to see it. That's where we want to head. And finally, we can not only imagine our hopes, that is important to feel hopeful, or have eyes to see it all around us, but we can be the glimpse of what we hope for. The best example I can think of for this is my husband, Michael. He works for Anglicare at the moment. He's passionate about social justice. And about 10 years ago, he was really disturbed with how we could help refugees settle into Australian society. He really wanted to make a difference. Sort of didn't know what to do, and he just gathered a group of friends and interested people. And at the time, the government was allowing Syrian refugees to come into the Northern Beaches where we live. And so between them, they'd never set up a charity. They had no idea what they were doing, but they just were passionate to be this glimpse of love and how the Australian community could help these refugees. So 10 families came out, and what they did was they got all the different churches on the Northern Beaches to sort of get, a family was attached to a couple of churches, so there were lots of people to support them, help them integrate. And that was 10 years ago. These families have all done so well. We had a Syrian refugee, beautiful name, lady, she's a Syrian Orthodox lady named Samira. She moved in with us for 18 months. And we helped her settle in. It was hysterical watching her in the waves at the beach for the first time. She'd never been. All these things, you know, it sort of cost us something to be the glimpse, but it was wonderful. She went to TAFE, she got her accountancy qualifications, she got her own place. And these families have these great stories to tell because Michael and his friends wanted to be the glimpse of what they were hoping for, which was justice and love and compassion. So I wonder what really stirs your heart. What's really meaningful to you? What are your hopes for the next 5 years or 10 years for you, for yourself, for your family, for humanity, for our world? And how can we not just imagine the glimpse or notice, it's still good to have eyes to see it, but even be it? So my hope is that these reflections will help us to have hope and be that glimpse of hope. Thank you very much.